Crimson Road Justice. Susanna Annie Boone had dedicated her life to protecting her tribe, but when Jackson Mercer, a renegade soldier, stumbled into her camp wounded, she was torn between duty and a forbidden attraction. He gripped her hand, his voice strained. "Help me, sister," he murmured. "And maybe I can help you." Chapter 1. The Weight of Two Worlds. The wind, a restless spirit, whipped across the mesa, carrying with it the scent of dry earth and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Susanna Annie Boone knelt by the small, crackling fire, her fingers tracing the intricate beadwork of her grandmother's pouch, a tangible link to a past that felt both achingly close and impossibly distant. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the sharp angles of her cheekbones and the determined set of her jaw, features that spoke of a life lived in the crucible of two worlds. Her hair, the color of raven's wings, was braided tightly, a practical necessity in this unforgiving land, but a few stray strands escaped, framing eyes that held the deep, unsettling blue of a twilight sky. She was 58, a woman who had seen more sunrises and sunsets than she cared to count, each one etching a new line of experience onto her face. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of working the land and tending to her people, were a testament to her resilience. Yet, beneath the tough exterior, a weariness had settled deep in her bones, a weariness born not of physical exhaustion, but of the constant, gnawing tension between her heritage and the encroaching world of the white settlers. Annie was a bridge, a precarious, often crumbling one, between the traditions of her Native American ancestors and the relentless tide of progress that threatened to sweep everything she held dear away. Her father, a white trapper named Elijah Boone, had met her mother, a woman of the Shoshone tribe, during his travels. He'd stayed, captivated by her spirit and the stark beauty of the land, but his presence had always been a source of both love and conflict within the tribe. Annie, the product of that union, carried the weight of both worlds within her. The pouch she held contained herbs, carefully dried and selected, each one carrying a specific purpose, a whisper of healing power. Her grandmother, a woman of profound wisdom and connection to the earth, had taught her the ancient ways, the secrets of the plants and the rhythms of the land. These teachings were more than just knowledge, they were the very essence of her identity, a lifeline to a heritage that was slowly being eroded by the relentless pressure of the outside world. Tonight, the weight of that responsibility felt heavier than usual. The council meeting earlier that evening had been fraught with tension. The younger generation, fueled by anger and a sense of injustice, were pushing for a more aggressive stance against the encroaching settlers, the cattle barons who claimed the land as their own, ignoring the ancient rights of the people who had lived here for generations. The elders, their faces etched with the wisdom and sorrow of experience, cautioned patience, reminding them of the bloody consequences of past conflicts. Annie had found herself caught in the middle, her voice a lone plea for a path that honored both tradition and the harsh realities of their situation. She understood the anger of the young warriors, their desire to fight for what was rightfully theirs. She felt it burning within her own heart, a simmering rage against the injustices they had endured. But she also carried the wisdom of her grandmother, the understanding that violence often begot more violence, that true strength lay not in brute force, but in resilience, in finding a way to survive, to adapt, to preserve their way of life even in the face of overwhelming odds. Her gaze drifted towards the horizon, where the last sliver of the sun was disappearing, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep, bruised purple. The vastness of the landscape, the sheer, untamed beauty of it, always filled her with a sense of awe and a profound sense of belonging. This was her land, her heritage, the very essence of her being. And she would protect it, even if it meant walking a tightrope between two worlds, forever caught between her duty to her people and the whispers of her own heart. A sudden rustling in the nearby brush startled her. Her hand instinctively went to the knife sheathed at her hip, a finely crafted blade, a gift from her father. Her senses, honed by years of living close to the land, were instantly alert. It could be an animal, a deer or a coyote, drawn by the scent of the fire. But the air held a strange stillness, a sense of anticipation that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. She rose slowly, her movements fluid and silent, her eyes scanning the shadows that danced around the edges of the firelight. The wind seemed to hold its breath, the only sound the crackling of the flames and the distant, haunting cry of the coyote. Then she saw him. A figure, slumped against a large rock, his form barely visible in the deepening gloom. He was clearly injured, his clothes torn and stained with what looked like dried blood. A white man. A stranger. And in this land, strangers often meant trouble. Her hand tightened on the hilt of her knife, her mind racing, weighing the risks, the potential danger. He was hurt, there's no denying that. But to reach out a hand to help. A low groan escaped his lips, a sound of pain that cut through the silence. And in that moment, Annie's decision was made. Not by logic, not by reason, but by something deeper, a primal instinct, a flicker of compassion that refused to be extinguished, even in this harsh and unforgiving land. She would help him, but she would be careful, very careful, for in this world, trust was a precious commodity and often a deadly one. The very air was charged, like static before lightning. The question was not if the storm would come, but when. Chapter 2. A stranger's plea. Annie approached the stranger cautiously, her knife still held loosely at her side, ready to be drawn at a moment's notice. As she drew closer, the firelight illuminated his features more clearly. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 30s, with a rugged, handsome face framed by dark, unruly hair matted with sweat and dust. His clothes, once the uniform of a soldier, were torn and ragged, bearing the marks of a hard-fought journey. A deep gash ran across his left arm, and his breathing was shallow and labored. He stirred slightly as she approached, his eyes fluttering open. They were a startling shade of green, clouded with pain and exhaustion, but there was a flicker of something else there too, a spark of defiance, a refusal to surrender. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused at first, then sharpening with a sudden, desperate intensity. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Please." Annie hesitated for a moment, her ingrained caution warring with her innate compassion. She was a healer, trained to ease suffering, but she was also a protector, bound by duty to her people. This man was an outsider, a potential threat. Yet, looking at him, seeing the pain etched on his face, the vulnerability in his eyes, she couldn't turn away. She knelt beside him, her movements slow and deliberate, giving him time to react, to understand that she meant him no harm. "I am Annie," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Who are you?" He struggled to speak, his breath catching in his throat. "Jackson," he managed, his voice strained. "Jackson Mercer. Sergeant. U.S. Cavalry." He winced, a spasm of pain crossing his face. "Ambushed. Comanches." Annie's heart skipped a beat. Comanches. A rival tribe, known for their fierce warriors and their unrelenting hostility towards both settlers and other Native American groups. If he was telling the truth, he was lucky to be alive. But why was he here, so far from the usual patrol routes? And why was he alone? She carefully examined his wound. It was deep, but thankfully not festering. She would need to clean it and bind it, and he would need rest and nourishment if he was to have any chance of recovery. "I will help you," she said, her voice firm but gentle. "But you must trust me." He looked at her, his green eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her sincerity. There was a long silence, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of the coyote. Finally, he nodded, a single, almost imperceptible movement of his head. "I trust you," he whispered, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I have no choice." He closed his eyes briefly and added, almost to himself, "Sister." Annie frowned at that. She knew what he meant. He was trying to speak to her as an equal, even though she was a native woman and he a soldier. He was asking to be treated the same. It was a bold move, but she appreciated the intention. She retrieved a water skin from her supplies and held it to his lips. He drank deeply, the water reviving him slightly. Then, she set about cleaning his wound, using a mixture of herbs and water from her pouch. He winced as she touched him, but he didn't cry out. He was strong, she realized, both physically and mentally. A soldier, hardened by battle and accustomed to pain. As she worked, she couldn't help but wonder about his story. What had brought him to this desolate place? What had he seen? What had he done? There was a darkness in his eyes, a shadow that spoke of a past he couldn't outrun. And yet, there was also a glimmer of something else, a flicker of hope, a yearning for something more. The silence between them was punctuated only by the sounds of her work and his labored breathing. Annie found herself strangely drawn to him, to this wounded stranger who had stumbled into her life. It was more than just compassion, more than just the healer's instinct to alleviate suffering. It was a connection, a recognition of something shared, a sense of kinship that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. She finished binding his wound with a clean strip of cloth, her fingers lingering on his skin for a moment longer than necessary. He opened his eyes and looked at her, a question in their depths. "Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice stronger now. I was your enemy." Annie met his gaze, her blue eyes unwavering. "I am a healer," she said simply. "I help those who are in need." "And you?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You are not my enemy. Not tonight." He held her gaze for a long moment, then slowly nodded. A faint smile touched his lips, a brief, fleeting expression that transformed his face, revealing a glimpse of the man he might have been before the harsh realities of the frontier had taken their toll. "Thank you, Annie," he said, his voice filled with a sincerity that surprised her. "I won't forget this." Annie felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, a vulnerability she couldn't afford. But for tonight, she allowed herself to feel it, to acknowledge the connection that had formed between them, a fragile bond forged in the heart of the wilderness. She knew this was only the beginning. His presence changed everything, and yet, she was still uncertain where it will lead. But he was here and she was here. And the night was young. Chapter 3. Scars beneath the surface. The night deepened, the stars emerging in their full, breathtaking glory. A vast, shimmering tapestry spread across the inky blackness. Annie had built up the fire, adding more wood to ward off the chill that settled over the mesa as the hours passed. Jackson had fallen into a fitful sleep, his body exhausted from his ordeal, but his mind clearly still troubled. He murmured in his sleep, his brow furrowed, his hands clenching and unclenching. Annie watched him, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. She had moved him closer to the fire, wrapping him in a thick buffalo robe to keep him warm. She had also given him a tea brewed from willow bark and other herbs, a remedy to ease his pain and promote healing. He had taken it gratefully, his eyes meeting hers with a silent acknowledgement of her care. As she sat beside him, watching the flames dance and listening to the sounds of the night, Annie found herself reflecting on her own life, on the scars she carried beneath the surface. Like Jackson, she had known pain and loss, betrayal and hardship. She had lost her parents at a young age, her father to a fever that swept through the region, her mother to a grief that had slowly consumed her spirit. She had been raised by her grandmother, a woman of immense strength and wisdom, who had taught her the ways of her people, the importance of resilience, and the power of healing. But even her grandmother's love and guidance couldn't shield her from the prejudice and discrimination she faced as a woman of mixed heritage. She was often caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The white settlers saw her as an Indian, a savage to be feared or pitted. Her own tribe, while accepting of her, often viewed her with a degree of suspicion, wary of her ties to the outside world. She had learned to navigate this treacherous landscape, to build a wall around her heart, to protect herself from the pain of rejection and the sting of prejudice. She had dedicated her life to serving her people, using her skills as a healer to ease their suffering, to be a bridge between their traditional ways and the encroaching world of the white man. But beneath the surface, a deep loneliness had taken root, a yearning for connection, for belonging, for a love that transcended the boundaries of race and culture. She had once believed she had found that love with a young warrior from her tribe, a man named Running Elk. They had been betrothed, their future seemingly secure. But fate, as it often did in this harsh land, had intervened. He had been killed in a raid, leaving Annie heartbroken and alone. She had never allowed herself to love again, fearing the pain of loss, the vulnerability that came with opening her heart. She had buried herself in her work, in her duty to her people, convincing herself that it was enough, that she didn't need anything more. But now, watching this wounded soldier sleep, feeling the strange pull of connection that had formed between them, she wondered if she had been wrong. Was it possible to find love again, to heal the scars of the past, and embrace the possibility of a new beginning? Jackson stirred, his eyes opening slowly. He looked at her, his gaze clear and focused. The pain momentarily subsided. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice still rough, but stronger than before. "You're safe," Annie replied. "You are in my camp on the mesa." He sat up slowly, wincing as he moved his injured arm. He looked around, taking in the surroundings, the fire, the vast expanse of the night sky. "I remember. The ambush," he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. "My men. They were all killed." Annie nodded, her expression somber. "You were lucky to survive." He looked at her, his green eyes searching hers. "You saved my life," he said.
"Why?"
Annie hesitated, unsure how to answer. She could tell him about her duty as a healer, about her compassion for those in need. But that wouldn't be the whole truth. There was something more, something she couldn't quite articulate, a connection that had formed between them, a sense of shared humanity that transcended their differences. "I saw a man in need," she said finally, "and I could not turn away." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly.
"I owe you a debt," he said.
"A debt I intend to repay." Annie shook her head. "You owe me nothing. I did what anyone would have done." He smiled faintly, a flicker of warmth in his eyes. "Not everyone, Annie. Not in this world." A silence fell between them, a comfortable silence filled with unspoken understanding. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on their faces. The wind whispered through the rocks, carrying the scent of sage and dust. The vastness of the night sky seemed to envelop them, a silent witness to their unlikely encounter. He was a mystery, she a closed book. The scars both held were starting to be exposed, yet neither knew how deep those scars went. The air was growing heavy, heavy with unspoken pasts. Chapter 4. Echoes of the Past. The first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky in hues of pale pink and gold, chasing away the shadows of the night. Annie had kept watch over Jackson throughout the night, tending to his wound and making sure he was comfortable. He had slept soundly for the most part, the healing herbs doing their work. As the sun rose, casting its warm glow over the mesa, Jackson awoke, his eyes clear and alert. He looked at Annie, a faint smile touching his lips. "I feel better," he said, his voice stronger than the previous night. "Much better." Annie nodded, pleased with his progress. "The herbs are working," she said. "But you still need rest." "I can't stay here," he said, shaking his head. I need to get back." "Back where?" Annie asked, her brow furrowing. "Back to your fort? Back to your people?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting away from hers. I don't know," he admitted. "I need to find out what happened. I need to find out who betrayed us." Annie's heart skipped a beat. Betrayal. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. She knew all too well the sting of betrayal, the way it could shatter trust and leave wounds that festered for years. "What makes you think you were betrayed?" she asked, her voice cautious. He looked at her, his green eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pain. "The Comanches knew our route," he said. "They knew exactly where we would be. Someone must have told them." He clenched his fists, his jaw tight with suppressed rage. "I had a friend. A scout. Named Two Feathers. He was one of your people, Annie. Shoshone. He rode with us, guided us. He was like a brother to me. Jackson's voice cracked with emotion. And he was killed in the ambush. I saw it happen. Annie felt a cold knot form in her stomach. Two Feathers. She knew the name. He was a distant relative, a young man known for his skill as a tracker and his loyalty to his friends. The thought that he might have been involved in a betrayal was deeply unsettling. Two Feathers was a good man, she said, her voice firm. He would not betray his friends. Jackson looked at her, his expression softening slightly. I want to believe that, Annie, he said. I need to believe that. But the evidence. It points to someone within our ranks. Someone I trusted. He paused, his gaze drifting towards the horizon, his eyes filled with a haunted look. I served with these men for years, he continued, his voice low and filled with pain. We fought together, bled together. We were a family.
And now?
Now I don't know who to trust. Annie understood his pain, his confusion, his sense of loss. She had felt the same way when Running Elk had been killed, when the world she had known had been shattered in an instant. I will help you, she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. I will help you find out what happened. I will help you find the truth. Jackson looked at her, his eyes searching hers.
Why?
He asked. Why would you do that for me? I am still a stranger to you. And a soldier. Annie met his gaze, her blue eyes unwavering.
Because I know what it is like to lose trust, she said.
Because I know what it is like to be betrayed.
And because...
She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. Because I believe you. I believe you are a good man, Jackson Mercer. And I will not let you face this alone. A flicker of hope ignited in his eyes, a warmth that chased away the shadows. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. His touch was gentle, yet firm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was forming between them. Thank you, Annie, he said, his voice filled with gratitude. I won't let you down. Annie squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a strange mixture of fear and anticipation. She knew that this was a dangerous path, that it could lead to more pain and loss. But she also knew that she couldn't stand by and do nothing. She had made a promise, a commitment to help this man, this stranger who had touched her heart in a way she hadn't thought possible. The echoes of both their pasts were converging, weaving a web around the both of them. She didn't know exactly what the future held. But the sun was up, and she knew she would see it through. Whatever it was. Chapter 5. The Thin Veil of Trust. The days that followed were a delicate dance of trust and suspicion. Annie and Jackson remained hidden in her camp, venturing out only when necessary to gather supplies and scout the surrounding area. Jackson's strength returned slowly but surely, his wound healing under Annie's care. As he recovered, he began to share more of his story, revealing the details of his life as a soldier, the camaraderie he had shared with his men, and the gnawing suspicion that one of them had betrayed him. He spoke of his commanding officer, Colonel Morrison, a stern but fair man who had always treated him with respect. He spoke of his fellow soldiers, a diverse group of men from different backgrounds, united by their shared experiences and their loyalty to the flag. And he spoke of Two Feathers, his Shoshone scout, the man he had considered a brother, the man whose death had left a gaping hole in his heart. Annie listened patiently, offering words of comfort and support, but also probing gently, trying to piece together the puzzle, to understand the dynamics of the relationships within Jackson's unit. She knew that trust was a fragile thing, easily broken and difficult to repair. And in this case, the stakes were high, the consequences of misplaced trust potentially deadly. She also shared her own story, telling him about her life, her upbringing, her struggles as a woman caught between two worlds. She spoke of her parents, her grandmother, her lost love, Running Elk. She revealed her hopes and fears, her dreams and disappointments, allowing him to see the woman beneath the stoic exterior. As they shared their stories, a bond formed between them, a connection that transcended their differences, their pasts, their present circumstances. They found solace in each other's company, a shared understanding of loss and resilience, a mutual respect for each other's strength and vulnerability. But even as their trust deepened, a shadow of doubt lingered. Annie couldn't completely shake her suspicion that Two Feathers might have been involved in the betrayal, despite her belief in his inherent goodness. She knew that loyalty could be a complicated thing, that people could be driven to desperate measures by circumstances beyond their control. She also sensed that Jackson was holding something back, that there were layers to his story that he hadn't yet revealed. She saw it in his eyes, in the way he sometimes avoided her gaze, in the subtle tension that gripped his body when certain topics were mentioned. One evening, as they sat by the fire, watching the stars emerge, Annie decided to confront him. "Jackson," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "there is something you are not telling me. Something about the ambush, about your past." He looked at her, his green eyes guarded, his expression unreadable. He hesitated for a long moment, then sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "You're right, Annie," he admitted. "There is something I haven't told anyone." He paused, his gaze shifting to the flames, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Before the ambush, before Two Feathers died, he told me something that made me question everything." Annie leaned forward, her heart pounding in her chest. "What did he tell you?" Jackson looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and disbelief. He told me that Colonel Morrison was not who he seemed to be, that he was involved in something illegal, something that put our lives at risk." Annie's mind reeled.
Colonel Morrison?
The man Jackson had described as stern but fair? It seemed impossible. But Two Feathers had been a man of integrity, a man who wouldn't have made such an accusation lightly. "What did he mean?" Annie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What was Colonel Morrison involved in?" Jackson shook his head.
"He didn't say.
He was going to tell me more."
But then
the ambush happened, and he was killed before he could finish. A cold wave of dread washed over Annie. If Two Feathers was telling the truth, then the betrayal went far deeper than she had imagined. It wasn't just a rogue soldier, a disgruntled comrade. It was the commanding officer himself, the man entrusted with their lives. "We need to find out the truth," Annie said, her voice filled with a newfound urgency. "We need to find out what Colonel Morrison is hiding." Jackson nodded, his expression determined. "I know," he said, "and I will, even if it's the last thing I do." The veil of trust, already thin, had been stretched to its breaking point. The truth, whatever it may be, was going to surface sooner or later. It always did. The question they now were faced with was, would it bring them close together, or destroy what little they had? Chapter 6. Between Duty and Desire. The decision to uncover the truth about Colonel Morrison set in motion a chain of events that tested Annie and Jackson's newfound trust and challenged their understanding of duty and desire. They knew they couldn't return to the fort directly. Jackson was still considered a deserter, and they had no proof of Morrison's alleged treachery. Instead, they decided to seek help from an unlikely source, a grizzled old prospector named Silas, who lived a solitary life in the hills, known for his knowledge of the region and his distrust of authority. Annie had met Silas years ago, trading with him for supplies and occasionally using his remote cabin as a refuge. He was a cantankerous old man, fiercely independent and suspicious of strangers, but he had a good heart beneath his rough exterior, and he respected Annie's knowledge of the land and her commitment to her people. The journey to Silas's cabin was arduous, taking them through rugged terrain and across treacherous canyons. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding the main trails and relying on Annie's knowledge of the land to guide them. The close proximity and the shared danger heightened the tension between them, the unspoken attraction that had been simmering beneath the surface, now a palpable force. They shared stolen glances, brief touches that sent shivers down their spines, and whispered conversations that revealed their growing feelings for each other. But they also knew that their situation was precarious, that any misstep could have dire consequences. They were caught between their duty to uncover the truth and their desire for a connection that seemed both impossible and inevitable. One evening, as they rested near a small stream, the moonlight casting a silvery glow on the water. Jackson turned to Annie, his green eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Annie," he said, his voice low and husky. I know this is not the time or the place, but I can't ignore this any longer. I care about you, more than I should." Annie's heart skipped a beat. She had felt the same way, her feelings for Jackson growing stronger with each passing day. But she was afraid of opening her heart again, afraid of the pain of loss, afraid of the complications that their relationship would inevitably bring. "Jackson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I care about you too. But we are from different worlds. Our lives are so different." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body.
"I know," he said.
"But I don't care. I don't care about the differences. I only care about you." He leaned closer, his eyes searching hers, his breath warm on her face. She could feel the pull of his attraction, the magnetic force that drew her to him. She knew she should resist, that it was too dangerous, too complicated. But her heart overruled her head, her desire overriding her reason. She closed the distance between them, her lips meeting his in a tentative, hesitant kiss. It was a kiss filled with longing, with passion, with the unspoken promise of something more. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, that bound them together in a way that neither of them could have anticipated. The kiss deepened, their bodies pressing together, their hearts beating as one. They lost themselves in the moment, forgetting the danger, the uncertainty, the world outside. They were just two souls, connected by a force stronger than duty, stronger than fear, stronger than the boundaries that separated them. But reality, as it always did, intruded. A sudden noise, the snap of a twig, broke the spell. They pulled apart, their eyes wide with alarm, their senses instantly alert. "Someone's there," Jackson whispered, his hand reaching for the rifle he had managed to salvage from the ambush. Annie nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They were exposed, vulnerable. They had let their guard down, their desire overriding their caution. They quickly gathered their belongings, extinguishing the fire and disappearing into the shadows. They didn't know who had been watching them, or what their intentions were. But they knew that their secret was no longer safe. Their forbidden love had been exposed, and the consequences could be devastating. The weight of the world, along with their own desires, were crushing them. They weren't alone anymore. Chapter 7. Shadows of Betrayal. The unseen observer proved to be a complication they hadn't anticipated, casting a long shadow over their already precarious situation. They reached Silas's cabin without further incident, finding the old prospector as gruff and unwelcoming as Annie remembered. However, upon recognizing Annie and hearing their story carefully edited to omit their burgeoning romance, Silas grudgingly agreed to help. "Morrison, eh?" Silas rasped, stroking his long, unkempt beard.
"Always knew there was something off about that man.
Too slick, too ambitious. Didn't trust him no further than I could throw him." Silas revealed that he had overheard rumors of unusual activity at the fort in recent months, late-night meetings, secretive shipments, and whispers of dealings with unsavory characters. He also confirmed that Colonel Morrison had been making frequent trips to a nearby mining town, a notorious haven for outlaws and gamblers. That town, Silver Gulch, it's a viper's nest, Silas warned. Morrison's been spending a lot of time there with a fella named Black Bart Callahan. Callahan's a known gunrunner, sells weapons to anyone with a coin, no questions asked. The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Jackson's suspicion that the ambush had been orchestrated to silence him, and two feathers gained credence. If Morrison was involved in illegal arms dealing, he would have had a strong motive to eliminate anyone who threatened to expose him. The revelation deepened the sense of betrayal that gnawed at Jackson. He had served under Morrison for years, trusting him implicitly. The thought that his commanding officer had been responsible for the deaths of his men, including his closest friend, filled him with a cold, burning rage. Annie, too, felt the weight of the betrayal, though from a different perspective. She had always been wary of the white man's institutions, having witnessed firsthand the injustices they inflicted upon her people. But she had also believed in the possibility of individual goodness, in the potential for trust and understanding across cultural divides. Morrison's treachery shattered that belief, reinforcing her sense of alienation and reinforcing her own betrayals. The knowledge of Morrison's dealings with Callahan also raised a disturbing question. Who were the weapons being sold to? If they were going to the Comanches, it would explain the ambush, but it would also mean a significant escalation of the conflict, threatening not only the settlers but also Annie's own people. The emotional strain of their situation was further compounded by the constant threat of discovery. They knew that Morrison would be looking for Jackson, and they couldn't be sure who they could trust. The close quarters of Silas's cabin and the shared danger intensified their feelings for each other, but it also made it more difficult to maintain the necessary distance. One afternoon, while Silas was out scouting, Jackson and Annie found themselves alone in the cabin. The tension between them was palpable, the unspoken desire a constant undercurrent. Jackson reached out and took Annie's hand, his touch sending a familiar shiver down her spine. "Annie," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know we can't. We shouldn't. But I can't pretend any longer. I'm falling in love with you." Annie's heart ached with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She felt the same way, her love for Jackson growing stronger with each passing day. But she knew that their love was forbidden, that it defied the boundaries of their worlds, that it could bring them nothing but pain. "Jackson," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I love you too. But it's impossible. We can't be together." He pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her, holding her tight. "Don't say that, Annie," he said. "We'll find a way. We have to." He kissed her then, a kiss filled with passion and desperation, a kiss that erased the doubts and fears, a kiss that promised a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. But even as they lost themselves in the moment, the shadows of betrayal loomed large, threatening to engulf them both. The darkness was closing in, and everything was at risk. The question was, how far will they go before it's too late? Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty. Their plan, hatched in the dimly lit confines of Silas's cabin, was fraught with risk. Jackson, disguised in rough prospector's clothing provided by Silas, would infiltrate Silver Gulch, posing as a buyer interested in Callahan's wares. The goal was to gather evidence of Morrison's involvement, enough to expose his treachery and clear Jackson's name. Annie, meanwhile, would remain with Silas, using her knowledge of the local tribes to gather intelligence and, if necessary, rally support. The separation was agonizing. The brief, stolen moments of intimacy had deepened their bond, making the prospect of being apart almost unbearable. Yet they both understood the necessity. Jackson's military experience made him the best choice for the dangerous mission in Silver Gulch, while Annie's connections within the Shoshone community were crucial for their long-term safety. Before Jackson left, they shared a final, desperate embrace. The fear of the unknown hung heavy in the air, the unspoken question of whether they would see each other again casting a long shadow over their farewell. "Be careful, Jackson," Annie whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Please come back to me." Jackson held her gaze, his green eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I will, Annie," he promised. "I swear it. I have something to live for now." He kissed her then, a kiss that sealed their vow, a kiss that tasted of salt and tears and the bittersweet promise of a future they might never share. Jackson's journey to Silver Gulch was uneventful, but the town itself was everything Silas had described: a lawless, chaotic place filled with the dregs of society. He found Callahan's establishment, a saloon and gambling den masquerading as a legitimate business, and managed to ingratiate himself with the gunrunner, posing as a disgruntled former soldier looking to make a profit. Callahan, a burly, ruthless man with a cold, calculating gaze, was wary at first, but Jackson's knowledge of weapons and his willingness to pay a premium price eventually won him over. Over several days, Jackson carefully gathered information, piecing together the details of Callahan's operation and his connection to Colonel Morrison. He learned that Morrison had been supplying Callahan with weapons stolen from the fort's armory, which Callahan then sold to various factions, including the Comanches. The motive was greed, pure and simple. Morrison was lining his pockets, profiting from the escalating conflict and endangering the lives of everyone in the region. The discovery filled Jackson with a cold, righteous fury. He had been betrayed, his men had been murdered, and the entire territory was on the brink of war, all for the sake of one man's avarice. He knew he had to expose Morrison, but he also knew that he needed concrete proof, something that would stand up to scrutiny. Meanwhile, Annie, back at Silas's cabin, was struggling with her own anxieties. The days stretched into an eternity, each hour filled with worry and uncertainty. She used her time to gather information from her contacts within the Shoshone community, confirming Jackson's suspicions about the increased flow of weapons to the Comanches. She also learned that a group of young Shoshone warriors, angered by the recent attacks and fueled by the new weapons, were planning a retaliatory raid against a nearby settlement. Annie knew that such a raid would be disastrous, leading to further bloodshed and strengthening Morrison's position. She faced a terrible dilemma. Her loyalty to her people urged her to support their fight for survival, but her love for Jackson and her commitment to justice demanded that she prevent the raid, even if it meant betraying her own tribe. The price of loyalty was high, and both Annie and Jackson were being forced to pay it. Their choices were tearing them apart, individually and together. The lines of what was right and wrong were blurred. And the cost. The cost was almost unbearable. Chapter 9. A glimmer of hope. Jackson's time in Silver Gulch yielded the evidence he needed, but at a significant cost. He managed to obtain a ledger detailing Callahan's transactions, including several entries that clearly implicated Colonel Morrison. However, his close proximity to Callahan and his increasingly suspicious activities had drawn unwanted attention. Callahan's men were growing wary, their eyes following Jackson's every move. One evening, as Jackson was attempting to discreetly copy the ledger, he was confronted by Callahan himself. The gunrunner, his face contorted with rage, accused Jackson of being a spy. A brutal fight ensued, Jackson barely managing to escape with his life, the ledger clutched tightly in his hand. He fled Silver Gulch under the cover of darkness, pursued by Callahan's men. He knew he had to get back to Annie, to warn her and to deliver the evidence that would expose Morrison. But the journey was perilous, his pursuers relentless. Meanwhile, Annie had made a difficult decision. She had contacted the elders of her tribe, revealing her knowledge of the planned raid and pleading with them to intervene. She spoke of Jackson, of his courage and his commitment to justice, and of the devastating consequences that would follow if the raid went ahead. Her words were met with resistance and suspicion. Many of the elders were wary of her ties to the white man, and they were reluctant to trust Jackson's motives. But Annie's reputation as a healer and her unwavering dedication to her people eventually swayed them. They agreed to meet with the young warriors, to try to dissuade them from their course of action. The meeting was tense and fraught with emotion. The young warriors, fueled by anger and grief, were eager to avenge their fallen comrades. They accused Annie of betrayal, of siding with the enemy. But the elders, guided by Annie's wisdom and her plea for peace, managed to convince them to stand down, at least temporarily. It was a small victory, a glimmer of hope in a situation that seemed increasingly bleak. But Annie knew that it was only a temporary reprieve. The underlying tensions remained, and the threat of violence still loomed large. As she waited for Jackson's return, her anxiety grew with each passing hour. She knew that he was in danger, that his mission was fraught with peril. She prayed for his safety, her heart aching with the fear of losing him. Then, one morning, as the sun was rising, she saw him. He was riding towards the cabin, his horse exhausted, his body bruised and battered. But he was alive, and he was holding the ledger. Their reunion was a mixture of relief and joy, a brief moment of respite in the midst of the storm. They embraced, their bodies clinging together, their hearts beating as one. "I got it, Annie," Jackson said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I got the proof." Annie looked at the ledger, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. She knew that this was a turning point, that their actions from here on out would determine the fate of everyone involved. But even as they celebrated their small victory, they knew that the battle was far from over. Morrison was still out there, powerful and dangerous. And they were running out of time. The storm that was brewing had just found a new source of lightning. And they were right in the center of it all. It was a small glimmer, but a glimmer all the same. Hope was a fragile, dangerous thing.
Chapter 10.
The Unforgiving Land. With the ledger in their possession, Jackson and Annie knew they had to act quickly. They decided to take the evidence to General Howard, the regional commander based at a larger fort several days' ride away. They hoped that Howard, known for his integrity and his commitment to upholding the law, would be willing to investigate Morrison's actions and bring him to justice. Leaving Silas behind to watch over the cabin and maintain contact with Annie's tribe, they set out on their perilous journey. The land was unforgiving, a vast expanse of desert and mountains, with dangers lurking around every corner. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding the main trails and relying on Annie's knowledge of the terrain to guide them. The journey tested their endurance, both physically and emotionally. They faced scorching heat, dwindling supplies, and the constant threat of discovery by Morrison's patrols or hostile Native American groups. The close proximity and the shared danger heightened the tension between them, their love for each other a constant source of strength and vulnerability. They shared quiet moments under the vast, star-studded sky, finding solace in each other's presence, their whispered conversations a testament to their growing bond. But they also knew that their future was uncertain, that their love was a fragile flame flickering in the face of a raging storm. One evening, as they were camped near a small spring, they were ambushed by a group of Comanches. The attack was sudden and brutal, the warriors emerging from the shadows with a terrifying war cry. Jackson and Annie fought back fiercely, their combined skills proving surprisingly effective. Jackson, using his military training, and Annie, drawing on her knowledge of traditional fighting techniques, managed to repel the attack, but not without sustaining injuries. Jackson took an arrow to the shoulder, while Annie suffered a deep gash on her arm. They tended to each other's wounds, their hands trembling, their hearts pounding with adrenaline and fear. The attack served as a stark reminder of the dangers they faced, the fragility of their lives, and the ever-present threat of violence that permeated the land. "We can't give up, Annie," Jackson said, his voice strained with pain. "We have to keep going. We have to get to General Howard." Annie nodded, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I know," she said. "We will. We'll get through this. Together." They pressed on, their bodies aching, their spirits weary, but their resolve unbroken. They were driven by their love for each other, their commitment to justice, and their hope for a better future, a future where they could finally be free from the shadows of betrayal and the threat of violence. The land, though unforgiving, also offered moments of unexpected beauty. They witnessed breathtaking sunsets, vast canyons bathed in golden light, and the silent majesty of the mountains. These moments served as a reminder of the enduring power of nature, the resilience of life, and the enduring hope that flickered within their hearts. As they neared General Howard's fort, their anticipation grew, mingled with a sense of trepidation. They knew that they were placing their trust in a man they had never met, a man who could either save them or betray them. The unforgiving land had brought them to an even harsher, more unforgiving point. The land was one thing, mankind quite another. It was a challenge that both understood. Chapter 11. Whispers of Rebellion. Reaching General Howard's fort was only the first step in a long and arduous process. While the general listened to their story and examined the ledger with a grave expression, he was hesitant to act without further corroboration. He was a cautious man, bound by military protocol and wary of accusing a high-ranking officer like Colonel Morrison without irrefutable proof. "This is a serious accusation, Mr. Mercer," General Howard said, his voice stern. "I cannot simply take your word for it, even with this ledger. I need more evidence, something that will stand up in a court-martial." Jackson, still recovering from his arrow wound, argued passionately, recounting the ambush, 2 feathers warning, and the overwhelming evidence of Morrison's illegal arms dealings. Annie, too, spoke eloquently, describing the devastating impact of Morrison's actions on her people and the escalating threat of war. General Howard, while sympathetic, remained unmoved. He ordered Jackson to be placed under guard, pending further investigation, and assigned Annie to the care of the fort's physician, a kind but somewhat patronizing woman named Dr. Emily Carter. The days that followed were filled with frustration and anxiety. Jackson, confined to a small, sparsely furnished room, felt like a caged animal, his freedom curtailed, his fate hanging in the balance. Annie, while allowed to move freely within the fort, felt equally constrained, her every move watched, her interactions with Jackson limited. She befriended Dr. Carter, sharing her knowledge of herbal remedies and assisting her in treating the fort's sick and injured. Through Dr. Carter, Annie learned more about the political machinations within the fort and the widespread rumors of Morrison's corruption. She also discovered that a group of younger officers, disillusioned with Morrison's leadership, were secretly gathering evidence against him. These whispers of rebellion offered a glimmer of hope. Annie realized that they were not alone in their fight, that there were others within the fort who shared their desire for justice. She discreetly contacted these officers, sharing Jackson's story and the evidence from the ledger. They were cautious at first, but Annie's sincerity and her knowledge of the situation eventually won them over. Together, they devised a plan to gather the additional evidence General Howard needed. They would use Jackson's knowledge of Morrison's operations and Annie's connections within the Shoshone community to expose the full extent of his treachery. The plan was risky, requiring them to operate in secrecy and to trust each other implicitly. But they were driven by a shared sense of purpose, a belief that justice must prevail, even in the face of overwhelming odds. While the seeds of a plan were being sown within the fort's walls, Annie still wrestled with a growing unease regarding the simmering tensions outside. She knew the fragile peace brokered with her tribe was temporary, and that any spark might ignite another conflict. As Jackson and Annie set their plan in motion, the walls of the fort seemed to represent more than just physical barriers. They were symbols of the larger, systemic issues that had led them to this point. They were both now on the same side of a dividing line. Yet, they each knew the division still existed. And the whispers of rebellion, they had a price. Chapter 12. The Heart's Reckoning. The plan to expose Morrison hinged on a daring maneuver, intercepting a shipment of weapons destined for Callahan. Jackson, with the help of the sympathetic officers, managed to secure a temporary release from his confinement, posing as a disgruntled soldier willing to betray his comrades for a price. Annie, using her contacts within the Shoshone community, identified the location where the shipment was to be delivered. The operation was fraught with peril. They were working with limited resources against a powerful and ruthless enemy, and any misstep could have dire consequences. But they were driven by their love for each other, their commitment to justice, and their hope for a future free from the shadows of betrayal. As they prepared for the operation, Jackson and Annie found themselves drawn closer than ever before. The shared danger, the constant threat of discovery, heightened their emotions, stripping away the remaining barriers between them. They shared stolen moments, whispered conversations, and tender embraces, finding solace and strength in each other's presence. One evening, as they sat together under the vast, star-studded sky, Jackson turned to Annie, his green eyes filled with a mixture of longing and regret. "Annie," he said, his voice low and husky. "I know we've talked about this before, but I can't help but think, what if we survive this? What if we actually manage to expose Morrison and clear my name? What then?" Annie's heart ached with a familiar mixture of joy and sorrow. She had dared to dream of a future with Jackson, a future where they could be together, free from the constraints of their different worlds. But she also knew that such a future was far from certain, that the obstacles they faced were immense. "I don't know, Jackson," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I want to believe. I want to hope. But..." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a wave of warmth through her body.
"Don't give up on us, Annie," he said. "Please.
We've come this far. We can't lose hope now." He kissed her then, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their commitment to each other, a kiss that promised a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. The following night, they put their plan into action. Jackson, along with the other officers, ambushed the weapons shipment, capturing the soldiers involved and securing the evidence that would definitively link Morrison to Callahan and the illegal arms trade. The operation was a success, but it came at a cost. One of the officers was killed in the firefight, and Jackson sustained a serious knife wound. Annie, who had been waiting anxiously at a prearranged location, rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear. She tended to his wound, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. He was alive, but he was badly injured. She knew that she had to get him to safety, to a place where he could receive proper medical care. It was at that time when Annie had to confront her own feelings, her own doubts, her own fears. As she sat in the dusty silence, she acknowledged that she could deny her own emotions no longer. As she looked at Jackson, she didn't see his uniform. She saw the man she loved. The heart's reckoning had come, and she knew, at last, that they would not turn back. Chapter 13. A Dance with Danger. With Jackson wounded and their carefully constructed plan exposed, Annie knew they had to move quickly. She helped him onto his horse, ignoring his protests, and they rode through the night, heading towards a hidden cave she knew of, a place used by her people for generations as a refuge. The journey was agonizing. Jackson, weakened by blood loss, struggled to stay conscious. Annie, her own strength waning, pushed herself to the limit, driven by her love for him and her determination to keep him safe. They reached the cave just as dawn was breaking, the rising sun casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. Annie helped Jackson inside, making him as comfortable as possible on a bed of soft furs she had brought with her. She cleaned and bandaged his wound, using her knowledge of herbal remedies to ease his pain and prevent infection. As she tended to him, their roles reversed. He was now the vulnerable one, relying on her strength and her care. And she was the protector, the healer, the one who would do anything to save him. The cave was a sanctuary, a place of peace and quiet, far from the turmoil and danger of the outside world. But it was also a prison, a place where they were trapped, their future uncertain. They spent the next few days in the cave, Jackson slowly recovering from his wound, Annie watching over him, her heart filled with a mixture of love and fear. They talked, sharing their hopes and dreams, their fears and regrets, their bond deepening with each passing hour. But they also knew that they couldn't stay hidden forever. Morrison would be looking for them, and their enemies were closing in. They had to find a way to expose Morrison's treachery, to clear Jackson's name, and to secure their freedom. Annie decided to take a dangerous gamble. She would return to the fort, using her friendship with Dr. Carter and her connections with the sympathetic officers to gather more information and to rally support for Jackson. It was a risky plan, requiring her to walk a tightrope between trust and betrayal, between loyalty and deception. But she was willing to do anything to save Jackson, to secure their future together. Before she left, she shared a tender moment with Jackson, their eyes meeting, their hands clasping, their hearts beating as one. "Be careful, Annie," Jackson whispered, his voice weak, but filled with love. "Please come back to me." Annie kissed him, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their vow, a kiss that promised a future that seemed both impossible and inevitable. "I will," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise. I'll always come back to you." She left the cave, disappearing into the shadows, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She was walking into the lion's den, dancing with danger, her every step a gamble. She knew the price of failure, but the stakes could not be higher. Chapter 14. Broken Bonds, New Beginnings. Annie's return to the fort was a carefully choreographed dance of deception and daring. She presented herself as a concerned friend, seeking news of Jackson and offering her assistance to Dr. Carter. She subtly probed for information, gathering intelligence about Morrison's movements and his increasingly desperate attempts to cover his tracks. She also reconnected with the sympathetic officers, sharing her knowledge of Jackson's condition and their plan to expose Morrison. They were wary at first, but Annie's unwavering determination and her genuine concern for Jackson eventually won them over. Together, they devised a new strategy. They would use the upcoming officers' ball, a lavish event attended by General Howard and the entire fort's elite, as an opportunity to confront Morrison and present their evidence. The plan was audacious, requiring them to navigate the treacherous social landscape of the fort, to outwit Morrison's spies, and to convince General Howard to take action. But they were driven by their belief in justice, their loyalty to Jackson, and their hope for a better future. As the day of the ball approached, Annie found herself increasingly torn between her duty to her people and her love for Jackson. She received word that the young Shoshone warriors, despite the elders' efforts, were again planning a raid, fueled by their anger and the continued flow of weapons from Morrison. She knew that she had to intervene, that she had to prevent the raid, even if it meant betraying her own tribe. But she also knew that doing so would jeopardize her position at the fort, making it more difficult to expose Morrison. She faced a terrible dilemma, a choice between two loyalties, two loves, two worlds. She prayed for guidance, for strength, for a way to reconcile the conflicting demands on her heart. On the evening of the ball, Annie dressed in a simple but elegant gown, a gift from Dr. Carter. She felt out of place among the fort's elite, her heart heavy with the weight of her secrets and the burden of her responsibilities. She mingled with the guests, exchanging polite conversation, her eyes constantly searching for Morrison, her senses alert for any sign of danger. She saw him across the room, his face flushed with arrogance, his eyes scanning the crowd, his demeanor that of a man who believed he was untouchable. As the evening progressed, Annie, with the help of the sympathetic officers, subtly maneuvered Morrison into a private conversation with General Howard. They presented their evidence, the ledger, the testimonies of the captured soldiers, and Annie's own account of Morrison's dealings with Callahan. Morrison, initially dismissive, became increasingly agitated as the evidence mounted against him. He denied the accusations, blaming Jackson and Annie, accusing them of treason. But General Howard, his face grim, his eyes filled with disappointment, was no longer swayed by Morrison's lies. The confrontation reached a climax when Jackson, his wound still healing, appeared at the doorway, his presence a living testament to Morrison's treachery. He stood tall, his gaze unwavering, his voice filled with righteous anger. "You betrayed us, Colonel," Jackson said, his voice echoing through the silent room. "You murdered my men, and you will pay for your crimes." Morrison, his facade of control shattered, lunged at Jackson, drawing a hidden pistol. But before he could fire, one of the sympathetic officers intervened, disarming him and placing him under arrest. The bonds of trust, broken by Morrison's treachery, were finally severed. And in their place, new beginnings were forged, new alliances formed, new hopes ignited. The old order was crumbling, and what would replace it was still unknown. But a change had come. Chapter 15. The Storm Within. The arrest of Colonel Morrison marked a turning point, but it did not bring immediate peace. The four remained in a state of turmoil, the officers and soldiers grappling with the shock of Morrison's betrayal and the uncertainty of what the future held. General Howard, determined to restore order and discipline, launched a full-scale investigation, uncovering a web of corruption that extended far beyond Morrison himself. Jackson, though vindicated, was still recovering from his wounds, both physical and emotional. He was haunted by the memories of the ambush, the deaths of his men, and the betrayal of the man he had once trusted. He struggled with guilt, with anger, with a profound sense of loss. Annie remained by his side, her love and support a constant source of strength. She tended to his wounds, listened to his nightmares, and held him close when the darkness threatened to overwhelm him. She understood his pain, having experienced her own share of loss and betrayal. But even as she cared for Jackson, Annie was battling her own internal storm. She was still torn between her loyalty to her people and her love for Jackson, between her desire for peace and her commitment to justice. She received word that the Shoshone elders, inspired by her courage and her unwavering dedication to her people, had finally managed to quell the planned raid. But the underlying tensions remained, the threat of violence still looming large. Annie knew that she had to find a way to bridge the gap between the two worlds, to create a lasting peace that would benefit both her people and the settlers. But she also knew that it would be a long and arduous process, requiring patience, understanding, and a willingness to compromise. One evening, as she and Jackson sat together outside the fort, watching the sun set over the vast, rugged landscape, they talked about their future, their hopes and dreams, their fears and uncertainties. "What will we do, Annie?" Jackson asked, his voice filled with a mixture of longing and apprehension. "Where will we go? How will we live?" Annie looked at him, her blue eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "I don't know, Jackson," she said. "But I know this. We'll do it together. We'll face whatever comes our way, side by side." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "We've been through so much," she said. "We've survived so much. We can survive anything as long as we have each other." Jackson squeezed her hand, his gaze meeting hers, his heart filled with gratitude and hope. "I love you, Annie," he said. "More than words can say." "I love you too, Jackson," she whispered. "More than life itself." They kissed then, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their commitment to each other, a kiss that promised a future filled with love, hope, and the enduring strength of their bond. But even as they embraced, the storm within them raged on. The external threats had been neutralized for the moment, but the internal struggles, the doubts, the fears, the uncertainties, those remained. They had weathered one storm, but a storm within, that was something far more dangerous. They had to face it together. Chapter 16. A Promise in the Dust. With Morrison's arrest and the subsequent investigation, a semblance of order returned to the fort, but the underlying tensions between the settlers and the Native American tribes remained. General Howard, recognizing Annie's unique position as a bridge between the two cultures, asked her to serve as an intermediary, helping to negotiate a lasting peace. It was a daunting task, fraught with challenges and potential pitfalls. Annie knew that she would face resistance from both sides, that she would be viewed with suspicion by some, and that her efforts might ultimately fail. But she also knew that she had to try, that she had a responsibility to her people, to Jackson, and to the future of the land she loved. Jackson, fully recovered from his wounds, supported her decision wholeheartedly. He had seen firsthand the devastating consequences of conflict, and he was committed to helping Annie build a better future, a future where peace and understanding reigned. Together, they embarked on a new journey, a journey of diplomacy and reconciliation. They traveled to the Shoshone villages, meeting with the elders and the young warriors, listening to their grievances, and sharing their vision of a peaceful coexistence. Annie spoke eloquently, her words carrying the weight of her heritage and her unwavering commitment to her people. She acknowledged the injustices they had suffered, the pain they had endured, but she also emphasized the importance of forgiveness, of understanding, of finding a way to live together in harmony. Jackson, too, spoke with passion and sincerity. He recounted his own experiences, his betrayal by Morrison, his growing respect for Annie and her people, and his belief that a better future was possible. Their efforts were met with mixed reactions. Some of the Shoshone were skeptical, wary of the white man's promises, their hearts hardened by years of conflict and betrayal. But others were receptive, their spirits weary of war, their hopes rekindled by Annie's words and Jackson's genuine desire for peace. Slowly, gradually progress was made. Trust was built, understanding was fostered, and a fragile peace began to take root. Annie and Jackson worked tirelessly, mediating disputes, negotiating agreements, and building bridges between the two cultures. They also found time for themselves, for their love, for their shared dream of a future together. They explored the land, sharing quiet moments under the vast, star-studded sky, their hearts filled with gratitude and hope. One evening, as they were camped near a small stream, Jackson took Annie's hand, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "Annie," he said, his voice husky with emotion, "I know we've faced many challenges, and will likely face many more. But I also know that we can overcome anything as long as we're together." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn object, a silver ring, engraved with a delicate flower design. It had belonged to his mother, a cherished keepsake he had carried with him throughout his life. "Annie," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "will you marry me? Will you be my wife?" Annie's heart overflowed with joy, her eyes filling with tears. She had dreamed of this moment, of a future with Jackson, of a life filled with love, hope, and the enduring strength of their bond. "Yes, Jackson," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of their love, their commitment, their promise to each other. They kissed then, a kiss that sealed their vow, a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that promised a future filled with hope, happiness, and the enduring beauty of their love. It was a promise in the dust, but a promise nonetheless. It was theirs and theirs alone. Chapter 17. The Renegade's Truth. The news of Jackson and Annie's engagement was met with mixed reactions. Within the fort, some celebrated the union as a symbol of reconciliation and hope, while others, clinging to old prejudices, viewed it with suspicion and disapproval. Among the Shoshone, there was similar division, some welcoming Jackson as a friend and ally, others wary of his white heritage and his past as a soldier. Jackson, anticipating this response, decided to confront the lingering doubts head-on. He requested a meeting with the Shoshone elders, a formal gathering where he would address their concerns and lay bare his heart and his intentions. Annie, initially apprehensive, supported his decision. She knew that true reconciliation required honesty and transparency, that any lingering doubts or suspicions would fester and undermine the fragile peace they were building. The meeting took place in a clearing near the Shoshone village, a sacred space where generations of tribal leaders had gathered to make important decisions. Jackson, dressed in a simple buckskin shirt and trousers, stood before the elders, his gaze steady, his demeanor respectful. He began by acknowledging the history of conflict and mistrust between the settlers and the Native American tribes. He spoke of the injustices his own people had inflicted upon the Shoshone, the broken treaties, the stolen lands, the countless acts of violence and betrayal. He then shared his own story, his upbringing in the East, his decision to join the army, his initial ignorance of the plight of the Native American people. He recounted his experiences in the West, his growing disillusionment with the Army's policies, his friendship with Two Feathers, and his ultimate betrayal by Colonel Morrison. He spoke of his love for Annie, his respect for her heritage, and his commitment to building a future where their two cultures could coexist in peace and harmony. He emphasized that he was no longer a soldier, that he had renounced his past and embraced a new life, a life dedicated to justice, understanding, and reconciliation. His words were met with silence, the elders listening intently, their faces impassive, their eyes scrutinizing his every gesture, his every expression. Then, one of the oldest elders, a woman named Wise Willow, Annie's great-aunt, rose to speak. Her voice was frail but firm, her words carrying the weight of generations of wisdom and experience. "You speak of trust, white man," she said. "But trust is not easily earned. It must be proven, not with words, but with deeds." Jackson nodded, his gaze meeting hers. "I understand, Wise Willow," he said. "And I am prepared to prove my trust, to demonstrate my commitment to your people, not just with words, but with actions." He then revealed his plan, a proposal to establish a joint trading post, a place where settlers and Shoshone could exchange goods and services fairly, without the interference of corrupt officials or greedy merchants. He also proposed the creation of a school, where children from both cultures could learn together, fostering understanding and respect from a young age. His proposal was met with cautious optimism. The elders recognized the potential benefits of his plan, but they also remained wary, their memories of past betrayals still fresh in their minds. After a long and intense deliberation, the elders finally reached a decision. They would agree to Jackson's proposal, but on a trial basis. They would monitor his actions closely, and if he proved true to his word, they would extend their full support. It was a victory, albeit a tentative one. Jackson had won the trust of the elders, at least for the moment. But he knew that he had a long way to go, that he had to continue to prove himself, to demonstrate his commitment to the Shoshone people and to the fragile peace they were building. The renegade's truth was out, exposed for all to see. But the future was still shrouded. The truth had been exposed, and it was accepted. Now, they would need to live it. Chapter 18. Facing the Dawn. The establishment of the trading post and the school became a symbol of the burgeoning cooperation between the settlers and the Shoshone. Jackson and Annie worked tirelessly, overseeing the construction, mediating disputes, and ensuring that both sides were treated fairly. The trading post became a bustling hub of activity, a place where people from different cultures could interact, exchange goods, and share stories. The school, initially small, attracted children from both communities, eager to learn and to build friendships across cultural divides. Annie, with her knowledge of both languages and cultures, served as a teacher and a translator, bridging the gap between the two worlds. Jackson, using his organizational skills and his commitment to fairness, managed the trading post, ensuring that everyone was treated with respect and that the transactions were honest and equitable. Their efforts were not without challenges. There were still those on both sides who resisted the change, who clung to old prejudices and resentments. There were incidents of misunderstandings, disagreements, and even occasional violence. But Jackson and Annie persevered, their love for each other and their commitment to peace serving as a constant source of strength. They also faced personal challenges. Annie struggled with the lingering doubts of some of her own people, who questioned her loyalty and accused her of betraying her heritage. Jackson, too, faced criticism from some of the settlers, who viewed him as a traitor, a squaw man who had abandoned his own kind. But they drew strength from each other, from the support of those who believed in their vision, and from the tangible progress they were making. They saw the children playing together, learning together, growing up without the hatred and prejudice that had poisoned previous generations. They saw the adults interacting, trading, sharing stories, building relationships based on mutual respect. As the seasons changed, the landscape transformed, reflecting the slow but steady progress they were making. The harsh, unforgiving desert bloomed with unexpected beauty, mirroring the blossoming of hope and understanding between the two communities. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their small cabin, overlooking the trading post and the school, Annie turned to Jackson, her eyes filled with a deep, abiding love. "We did it, Jackson," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "We actually did it. We built something beautiful, something lasting." Jackson smiled, his gaze meeting hers. "We did it together, Annie," he said. "And this is just the beginning. There's still so much more to do." They embraced, their hearts filled with gratitude, hope, and the enduring strength of their bond. They had faced the dawn together, overcoming countless obstacles, defying the odds, and building a future that was both brighter and more promising than they could have ever imagined. It was a dawn that belonged to them. The sun was up, and their work was just beginning. The light touched both their faces. Chapter 19. The Gathering Storm. Despite the progress made in fostering peace between the settlers and the Shoshone, a new threat emerged, casting a dark shadow over their hard-won achievements. A band of outlaws, led by the ruthless Black Bart Callahan, who had escaped justice after Jackson exposed his dealings with Morrison, began terrorizing the region, raiding ranches, attacking settlements, and sowing chaos and fear. Callahan, driven by a thirst for revenge and a desire to reclaim his lost power, had gathered a formidable force of disgruntled former soldiers, desperate criminals, and renegade Native Americans. He was determined to undermine the fragile peace that Jackson and Annie had worked so hard to build, and he saw them as his primary targets. News of Callahan's attacks reached Jackson and Annie, filling them with a sense of dread and foreboding. They knew that they were in danger, that their lives and the lives of those they cared about were at risk. But they also knew that they couldn't stand by and do nothing, that they had to confront this new threat, even if it meant putting their own lives on the line. Jackson, drawing on his military experience, began organizing a defense, gathering a force of volunteers from both the settlers and the Shoshone. He trained them in combat tactics, emphasizing the importance of unity and cooperation. Annie, using her knowledge of the land and her connections within the Native American community, gathered intelligence, tracking Callahan's movements and identifying his allies. She also worked to strengthen the alliance between the settlers and the Shoshone, reminding them of their shared interest in defeating the outlaws. The tension mounted as Callahan's attacks grew bolder and more frequent. The settlers and the Shoshone, initially hesitant to trust each other, began to work together, united by their common enemy and their shared desire for peace. Jackson and Annie, their love for each other a constant source of strength, prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They knew that the odds were against them, that Callahan's forces were larger and better equipped. But they were determined to fight, to protect their community, and to defend the fragile peace they had built. One evening, as they stood together on a hilltop, overlooking the vast, moonlit landscape, Jackson turned to Annie, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and determination. "We'll face this together, Annie," he said, his voice firm. "No matter what happens, we'll face it together." Annie nodded, her gaze meeting his. "I know, Jackson," she said. "And I wouldn't have it any other way." They embraced, their hearts beating as one, their love a beacon of hope in the gathering storm. They knew that the battle ahead would be fierce, that the outcome was uncertain. But they also knew that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that their love would give them the strength to face whatever came their way. The gathering storm was upon them, the metaphorical and literal one. They would face this as they had faced everything else. Together. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The final confrontation with Callahan and his outlaws took place near the trading post, the very symbol of the peace Jackson and Annie had striven to build. The outlaws, outnumbering the defenders, launched a fierce attack, their intent clear, to destroy everything Jackson and Annie had created and to claim the territory for themselves. The battle raged, a chaotic clash of gunfire, shouts, and the cries of the wounded. Jackson, leading the defense, fought with courage and skill, his military experience proving invaluable. He rallied the settlers and the Shoshone, inspiring them to fight for their homes, their families, and their future. Annie, too, played a crucial role, tending to the wounded, providing support, and even taking up arms herself when necessary. She moved through the chaos with grace and determination, her presence a beacon of hope and resilience. The fighting was brutal and relentless. The outlaws, driven by desperation and greed, fought with savage ferocity. The defenders, fighting for their homes and their loved ones, matched their intensity, their courage fueled by their commitment to peace and their love for Jackson and Annie. As the battle reached its climax, Jackson found himself face to face with Callahan. The outlaw leader, his face contorted with rage, lunged at Jackson, his knife flashing in the sunlight. They struggled, their bodies locked in a desperate embrace, their hatred for each other palpable. Jackson, though wounded and exhausted, fought with the strength of a man who had everything to lose. He managed to disarm Callahan, throwing him to the ground. But before Jackson could deliver the final blow, Callahan pulled a hidden pistol and fired. The shot struck Jackson in the chest, sending him reeling backward. Annie, seeing Jackson fall, screamed his name, her heart shattering into a million pieces. She rushed to his side, her hands trembling, her eyes filled with tears. "Jackson."
"No,"
she cried, cradling his head in her lap. Jackson, his face pale, his breathing labored, looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding love.
"Annie."
He whispered, his voice weak. I love you. His eyes closed, his body going limp. Annie, her heart breaking, held him close, her tears falling onto his face. But then, something miraculous happened. Jackson stirred, his eyes fluttering open. He looked at Annie, a faint smile touching his lips. I'm not gone yet, he whispered. The bullet, miraculously, had struck a silver locket he wore around his neck, a gift from Annie, deflecting it from his heart.
He was alive, wounded but alive.
With Jackson's survival, the tide of the battle turned. The defenders, inspired by his courage and fueled by their renewed hope, fought with even greater ferocity. Callahan, his forces dwindling, his spirit broken, was captured, his reign of terror finally brought to an end. The battle was over. The victory was won. But the cost was high. Many lives had been lost, many wounds inflicted. But from the ashes of destruction, a new hope emerged, a stronger bond between the settlers and the Shoshone, a deeper commitment to peace. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons had been fought, and love, courage, and resilience had prevailed. The future was still uncertain, but it was filled with promise, with the enduring strength of Jackson and Annie's love, and with the unwavering hope for a better tomorrow. A new horizon, a new beginning. And they lived. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to the enduring power of love, resilience, and the unwavering commitment to building a better future. Jackson and Annie, their bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome, continued to work tirelessly, fostering peace and understanding between the settlers and the Shoshone. The trading post flourished, becoming a thriving center of commerce and cultural exchange. The school expanded, educating generations of children from both communities, teaching them to respect each other's differences and to embrace their shared humanity. Jackson and Annie, though they never forgot the pain and loss of the past, focused on the future, on building a community where their children and their children's children could live in peace and harmony. They had 2 children, a son named Elijah, after Annie's father, and a daughter named Willow, after Annie's great-aunt. They raised them with love, teaching them the values of respect, compassion, and the importance of bridging cultural divides. They often sat on the porch of their home, overlooking the trading post, the school, and the vast, beautiful landscape that surrounded them, their hearts filled with gratitude and contentment. They had weathered many storms, faced countless challenges, but they had emerged stronger, their love deepened, their commitment to each other and to their community unwavering. One evening, as the sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple, Jackson turned to Annie, his eyes filled with a love that had only grown stronger with time. "We did it, Annie," he said, his voice soft. "We built a life together, a life filled with love, purpose, and peace." Annie smiled, her gaze meeting his, her heart overflowing with happiness. "Yes, Jackson," she said. "We did. And it's more beautiful than I ever imagined." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one, their love a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a legacy that would live on for generations to come. The sun set on their lives, but their legacy remained, a testament to the enduring power of their love and their success.
It was a good life.
A hard life, but a good one. And it was theirs. The end.